Hello, everyone. We're going to start the event. Welcome to LSE for this hybrid event. My name is George Kunnath, and I'm Associate Professor and Academic Lead for the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Program at the International Inequalities Institute. I'm very pleased to be here to welcome Dr. Richard Martin, Sam Nadel, and Pascale Frazer-Carroll, to also our online audience and our audience in person here today. Richard Martin is Assistant Professor of Law at the LSE Law School. He conducts socio-legal and doctrinal research at the intersection of criminal justice, human rights, and public law. Richard's monograph, Policing Human Rights, was joint runner-up of the Inner Temple Book Prize, New Authors Prize, and shortlisted for Peter Berg's Prize for Outstanding Legal Scholarship and Hart SLSA Book Prize for Early Career Academics. Welcome, Richard. Thank you. Sam Nadel is a PhD candidate at the Department of Social Policy at LSE. He is also director of the Social Change Lab, which focuses on studying the impact of protest movements and public opinion, public discourse, and policy. Sam has held a range of roles with the human rights and international development organizations, including Amnesty International UK and Oxfam GB. Welcome, Sam. Pascale Frazer-Carroll is an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity, a campaigner and social impact director. Most recently, she has held positions as the UK director and regional director for the UK and Australia at petition platform called change.org, which is the largest website for social change in the world. In these roles, she has led teams to support millions of people to use digital mobilizing tools to increase their ability to speak out against injustices and run people-powered campaigns. Welcome, Pascale. Today's event will discuss why protests matter, what the shrinking of democratic space means for social and economic activists, and what can be done to protect freedom of speech and the right to protest. This event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a video recording, subject to no technical difficulties. As usual, there will be a chance for you to put your questions to our speakers. For our online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please let us know your name and affiliation. For those of you here at the theater, I will let you know when we will open the floor for questions. If you can raise your hand, and then when I indicate, you can pose your question. In the same way as the online audience provide their name and affiliation, I will ask you to provide the same information before posing your question. I will try to ensure a range of questions from both our online audience and our audience in the theater. Following the event, this is important. Following the event, please join us for a drink reception outside the theater to continue this conversation. But now I am delighted to hand over to Richard Martin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and for joining us this evening. The good news is I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Bad news is I do have some notes that I'm going to rely on because after a day of teaching, I'm never entirely sure what's going to come out of my mouth or it's going to come out in the right order. What we see across democracies today, I think, at least liberal democracies here in Europe, is an increasing discomfort with aspects of street politics, peaceful, if disruptive, expressions of dissent. Even in liberal democracies, protest is being managed through legal restrictions, permits, noise restrictions, and outright suppression on protest methods, specific techniques of protest that have been around for a very long time, locking on, slow walking. We're now seeing specific target of legislative intervention. One special rapporteur recently didn't hold back when he described a wave of counter-protest laws in Europe contributing, and I quote, to the shrinking of the civic space and seriously threatening the vitality of democratic societies. I want to focus my attention this evening on the significant legal developments in England and Wales over the last few years. But I should say we can see these developments within a much wider historical frame of protest and its relationship with democracy. Think of public order legislation as the kind of statutory or legislative fossils of political struggles, with each new law marking where a movement became so effective, sufficient recalcitrance, disruption, that some version of the establishment over the last century has felt compelled to legislate it back to the periphery. The Public Order Act 1936 is a direct response to the British Union of Fascists. The Public Order Act 1986 emerged following the Brixton race riots and the miners' strike. Criminal Justice Act 1994 targeted hunt saboteurs and animal rights activists. And now we have the latest additions, Part 4 of the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act 2022 and the Public Order Act 2023. The Conservative government's response to Extinction Rebellion and environmental protests that have created a scale of civil disobedience that we haven't seen for some time. As social movement scholars Taro and Tilly tell us, protest movements ebb and flow within, and I quote, the limits set by political opportunity structures, regime controls, and the available repertoires of contention. And what we've seen in the last 5 years is when Extinction Rebellion has challenged the state's authority symbolically, but also when in London, custody suites almost reached capacity, challenging very directly the state's capacity to maintain order in its capital city. We saw police, government ministers, the companies that were targets of this disruption, scrambling to control the protesters' repertoires of contention. And I think the protest movement since 2018 offers a powerful lens to examine how law functions as part of the state's strategy when faced with these determined episodes of contention that undoubtedly also threatened the rights of others and threatened legitimate interests that the state can pursue, and the European Convention on Human Rights recognizes as legitimate restrictions on the qualified right to peaceful protest. I've identified, and I want to focus on three of what I think we could term legal repertoires of demobilization, three distinct but interconnected strategies that we've seen the state deploy in the last 5 years or so. The first strategy has been Parliament's swift response to executive calls for tougher public order powers. The powers that we've seen in Part 4 of the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act and the Public Order Act 2023, they didn't come about through a white paper, through consultation. They weren't found in a election campaign or mandate. They came about from a roundtable between the Home Office, police forces, and HS2, chaired by the Home Office, Sajid Javid at the time, and through the National Police Chiefs Council, the Metropolitan Police drafted a wish list of 20 powers that they would like to manage protest. We have seen a significant number of those now enacted in law. That's the genesis of this, right on the back of Extinction Rebellion. You'll find that in a footnote of the Her Majesty's Inspector Constabulary's report as to the genesis of this. And what we've seen is the Conservative government's majority in the House of Commons being extremely effective at passing that wish list of legislation. So the Part 4 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act broadened existing police powers, modifying the 1986 Act, allowing the Home Secretary, Parliament, handing over to the Home Secretary to define serious disruption to the life of the community. And that's the definition that we've seen quite recently and challenged in the courts. We have seen restrictions on noisy protests, on one-person protests, increasing sentencing lengths for offences, and reducing the mens rea, the mental requirement for a breach of police conditions. Perhaps most significantly, though, that Act placed public nuisance on a statutory footing with a maximum sentence of 10 years. And this has proven to be a powerful prosecutorial tool, especially when it's plugged into conspiracy, an agreement to commit a criminal course of conduct in which the parties to that agreement will form some role in that, being plugged into public nuisance that itself doesn't require any harm to actually come about. And we've seen this being used by prosecutors last couple of years. In addition to this, we have the 2023 Act. The offence of the 2023 Act, we have new criminal offences, new police powers. The offence to lock on defined extremely broadly, not just me locking onto somebody else, me locking a flag, a banner onto something constitutes a lock-on, remarkable breadth in definition. The offence of tunnelling, which arguably is already covered by aggravated trespass. Obstruction of major transport works, extremely broadly defined. The interference with national infrastructure that could be as satisfied by moving a cone, obstructing a particular worker from getting to A to B expediently. So it's the sheer breadth and imprecision of these offences, and we can talk a bit about the necessity of these, the extent to which these are already covered by criminal offences, the extent to which this was signaling to the police to get more involved, and also the construction of offences that directly interfere with the right to peaceful protest. The second strategy has played out in the courts. A fascinating question has emerged in recent years. Could offences of reasonable or lawful excuse that weren't designed per se for the protest context, they be used to potentially shield convictions where the basis of the conduct that constitutes the public order offence could be deemed to be an interference with the right to peaceful protest? Briefly say how this plays out. Initially, in a case called Ziegler, the Supreme Court opened the door, holding that deliberately obstructive protest with a more than de minimis impact remains protected by Articles 10 and 11. And this requires a proportionality assessment before the conviction. What does that mean? It means the court has to be satisfied that a fair balance has been struck ultimately in convicting you and interfering with your rights, counterbalancing that with the rights of others and the legitimate aims that the state can pursue. For protesters, this briefly offered hope of a chance to translate their conscientious motivations, their sincere beliefs, targeted civil disobedience into a proportionality test that, if successful, could distinguish criminal liability. So requiring courts to think about the fact, well, my protest, yes, it did break the law, but prima facie, I committed the conduct, I did it intentionally, but my defense and the reason why it's lawful is it was for a limited duration. It was entirely peaceful. It was carefully targeted. And thus an interference, the state convicting me would be a disproportionate interference with my right to peaceful assembly. In the end, this was quickly narrowed to a specific class of cases, the court finding that it was possible for Parliament to have already baked that assessment of proportionality into the offence itself, such that an individual court wouldn't be asking whether or not the interference was justified. So taking out that line of defence. Moving on, we've also had cases where without these statutory defences, some protesters have turned to what's known as jury equity, essentially appealing to jurors to vote with their conscience rather than strictly applying the law. Fascinating legal concept. Even when the facts clearly point to conviction, the jurors can acquit if they believe justice would be better served. But even this avenue has been narrowed. You might be familiar with the remarkable case of climate activists who glued themselves to London roads. When they appeared before Judge Reed here in London, he didn't just limit their defense, he explicitly forbade them from mentioning the very reasons of their protest. Climate change, he said, and fuel poverty are off limits. When the defendants stood their ground and spoke to these issues anyway, refusing to apologize, the judge's response was swift and severe: 6 weeks in jail for contempt of court. Finally, third strategy, briefly, has been the unprecedented use of civil injunctions. It's not just the criminal law getting involved here. We've seen unprecedented use of civil injunctions by energy companies, national highways, Transport for London, local councils. They've all obtained injunctions limiting what protesters can do, who they can associate with, and where they can go. And whilst this isn't a criminal offence, if you breach this, you face contempt of court. The sanctions for that can be up to 2 years imprisonment. These injunctions can be of huge geographic sweep, the whole of the HS2 route, London's M25, major highways, 17 critical Transport for London roads. Perhaps most insidious is that it's very hard to challenge these injunctions. Legal aid isn't available, protesters must pay out of their own pocket, risking the corporation's legal costs if they lose. Human rights barrister Adam Wagner puts it, these costs can, quote, hang over people's lives for years, stopping them getting mortgages, loans. It's pernicious. Unsurprisingly, therefore, many injunctions obtained by large corporations go completely unchallenged by protesters. So to conclude, these three trio of strategies, legislative expansion, judicial narrowing, and the use of civil injunctions, represent a sophisticated, overarching legal repertoire aimed at demobilizing environmental protest. As we consider these developments, we must ask ourselves, what does this tell us about our democracy's comfort with dissent, with peaceful protest that's protected by Articles 10 and 11?
Thank you very much, Richard. Richard, over to Sam.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Richard, for that. I mean, it's a bleak picture, isn't it? But I think it's important to set the context here and you know, what's been a rapidly shifting environment in the last really just 3 or 4, 5 years. But I'm Sam Nadel. I'm Director of Social Change Lab. So we're an organization that tries to understand a slightly different question, which is, what's the impact of protest, right? We can see it's under threat. We might morally have a problem with the fact that it is under threat. We might think civil and political rights are really important. But does protest really work? Is it something that needs to be defended because it's also an important tool for social change? And so we do that through research looking at the impact of protest on public opinion, impact on discourse, the type of language that's used around issues, and also on the political system. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this is, can protest, and we particularly look at disruptive protest, can it actually affect change on legislation? And I'm also a PhD student, so I'm sort of researching a lot of this stuff as well here in the social policy department. So I've been doing interviews with environmental activists and NGOs and surveys. And so it's all trying to answer that question of, does protest work, essentially? And just taking a step back, like thinking historically, the interest and support for protests waxes and wanes over history. So there's definitely periods in which people have a lot of enthusiasm for protests. We think back to 2019 and Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future and the school strikes. And there was definitely a sense not only that protests mattered, but it can also work, that it can contribute towards a shift in society and politics. And there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm, and we're certainly not there right now. A lot of things have happened since 2019. One thing is increasing repression and increasing legislation, criminalization of protest. But I think there's also a sense that protest hasn't necessarily delivered the goods. It hasn't necessarily shifted, it hasn't led to like sweeping new legislation on climate change, for example. And so we try and interrogate that bit and say, is protest really ineffective? And if so, how? Or can it actually make changes in ways we might not be aware of? And so there's sort of 3 areas that we try and focus on when it comes to the impact of protests and protest movements. And the first one is on public opinion. And so this is perhaps the clearest way in which protests can have an impact. We know that protests and some of the most controversial and disruptive protests are incredibly effective at just increasing the profile of an issue in quite a blunt way. It's like a blunt instrument to say, we're going to get our issue onto the agenda. We're going to get it in the news, even if that news coverage is incredibly negative. And the groups themselves who engage in protest have great like name recognition, right? In some of them are infamous, they're not just famous. So like Just Stop Oil, for example, incredibly unpopular group, but also incredibly high name recognition in ways that conventional protest groups would never gain, right? I think I saw some polling saying something like 87% of the British public know who Just Stop Oil are, right? So it's difficult because they're very unpopular, but they do gain a lot of attention. The key question then is, are protest movements effective at also shifting public opinion? Do they get people on side with their issues? And that's one of the key criticisms that's leveled at protest groups, is that actually they're so controversial, particularly the disruptive groups, that they turn people against an issue. And so I think the answer to that is it depends how you protest and when you protest and lots of other factors. So there was research on Extinction Rebellion in 2019. Immediately following their protests, 10% more of the British public expressed concern for the environment. They said climate change and the environment are a top issue for them immediately following the protest, like a day after the first protest. And that level of interest sustained until the COVID pandemic. It's not that simple, though. We've also seen research, and we're doing some work with people in Stanford, which shows actually the opposite effect. And in disruptive protests can also turn people against support for the issue. So there's some experimental research that showed that people were presented with a vignette and they read about a disruptive protest, different types of disruption, and actually support for the issue went in the wrong direction, right? They expressed the lower level of support for action on climate change after reading about those vignettes. So it's just to say that it's a complex picture, right? And one thing we might say is that protests can polarize. You can mobilize your supporters. You can mobilize people that are already predisposed to support your issue, but you also mobilize those who are predisposed to be against it, right? So it creates this polarization effect, which sometimes can be counterproductive. And another impact on public opinion that's quite interesting, we just did some research that we published showing that disruptive groups increase support for moderate groups. So that's been described as a radical flank effect. So our research showed that awareness of a Just Stop Oil protest led people to express more support for Friends of the Earth, which I think is a really interesting finding, right? Because suddenly, and like groups like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, they used to be the radicals in the room. Now they seem a bit old hat, maybe. But actually, disruptive protest is making them seem pretty feasible, right? Of course, we can support net zero. It's just we don't support the actions of these radicals. So that's like broad summary of some of the work on public opinion. The second area that we look at through our research is on discourse, right? So the ways in which issues are framed in society, the types of language that's used around particular issues. And there's compelling evidence, perhaps protest movements are uniquely placed to shift discourse, to shift the Overton window on what is acceptable and how we think about issues, because they sort of present a different vision of a world, right? They're not doing quiet insider advocacy where we try and get a new policy introduced. They're trying to change the whole conversation. And I think a really interesting example of this was the protest movements around gay rights and how they framed their campaign on equal marriage. So there was a quite strategic way of tapping into more conservative framings around equal marriage, emphasizing things like marriage as being associated with a symbol of love and commitment and stability. And that was a really effective way to change the conversation on marriage and equal marriage. And it was a really fundamental win for the gay rights campaign. Black Lives Matter also changed the narrative, you know, getting sometimes very controversial campaign, but there was a research that showed that language around like systemic racism and mass incarceration those types of phrases were used far more widespread in a far more widespread way on social media and mainstream media and Google searches as well, immediately following like well-publicized Black Lives Matter process. So this is all to say that protest movements can change the conversation. And then the final thing that we look at, the final bucket that we try and explore is impacts on the political system. And as I say, like this is often like the gold standard for protest movements. If you're not changing policy, then you're not really winning. And the biggest thing that a protest movement can do is change who's in charge, right? Change lead to the resignation. Their protests are so effective, the Prime Minister resigns, for example. And actually, there's been quite a few notable examples just in the last few months. So in Bangladesh, there was the civil service protests, widespread civil service protests last year, I think, and the Prime Minister stood down. Just 5 days ago, the Serbian Prime Minister stood down after mass protests. So like it can lead to political change, but most protest movements don't get that, or maybe even aren't demanding that. But there are other ways that we can think about the political system, and we can use other proxies to try and understand how protest movements can shift the political dial. So, for example, we're doing research at the moment looking at how people's expressed voting intentions changes as a result of protests, and we're finding that in the UK, for example, climate protests, when they happen, there's a very a moderate but important shift towards pro-climate parties. So we've seen a 1% increase in polling for the Green Party immediately following protests, and we see a shift away from far-right parties. So there's been a few other bits of research that have shown in Germany, for example, Alternative for Deutschland lost votes in national German elections in places where Fridays for Future protested, right? So it's like quite tangible ways in which politics shifts as a result of protests. And the final aspect of this is on policymaker attention. So we also see politicians talking more about the issues that protest movements are focused on. So we did some research on the group Insulate Britain. You might remember them. They were a precursor to Just Stop Oil. Again, very unpopular group. Lots of people say they had no impact on insulation in the UK. But and in a number of ways, they did shift the dial, because one way is that insulation suddenly became an issue that anyone was interested in talking about, right? It's probably the least sexy issue in politics, but suddenly we started to see massive mentions of insulation in parliaments and in media coverage and everything else. So again, they sort of shifted the discourse in politics. So, I mean, I've sort of highlighted some of the ways in which protest movements can have a relatively positive impact in relation to the goals of a movement. It's a messy picture, right? I think like there is the assumption that protest movements are counterproductive is not entirely wrong. And there is some evidence pointing towards the fact that they can polarize public opinion, and then they can mobilize your opponents. One researcher in a group of researchers in Stanford described this as an activist dilemma, which felt like a good summary, right? Protests is often engaging in a trade-off where, you know, you gain public awareness, you potentially gain political attention, you might move people in support of your cause, but you also mobilize your opponents. So I think that's quite a useful way to think about it as a tool that can be applied in certain contexts effectively, but it needs to be applied carefully. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you both. Those were two really insightful presentations, and much more academic than what I'm probably going to say is. Yeah, as was mentioned, I've spent most of my career working to support people who are often first-time organisers or grassroots groups with tools, coaching, strategies to support them to try to kind of create social change. And so a lot of what I speak about is going to be kind of like rooted in that lived experience. I was also a fellow here last year, so I'm going to touch on a bit of research as well. But I think it's important to think about the people, which might be some of you in this room, that are kind of engaging in protest, and what that looks like, means, and how different people are impacted by current and previous like legislation around it. I also, as George mentioned, one of my longest experiences was working at the petition change.org. So we would have hundreds of petitions that were started every day, and maybe not everyone knows that we'd have about 1 in 10 that would actually win. So a lot of people were successfully using the website as a foundational tool to achieve change. Another thing that people might not know is that they often ask me, or one of the first questions is like, do petitions really work? And usually I think the most important thing for people to know is that petitions would be, for those campaigns that win, petitions were part of like a broader strategy of a holistic set of tools in running a campaign that could eventually lead to change. And since I was working with a lot of those people that start petitions, I saw a lot of protests, because that was a tool that people would frequently use for a lot of the reasons that Sam explained. I probably won't go into all of them because you did that so well.
sorry.
No. I've got lots of other things to say. I think that, yeah, so, you know, things like disruption, attention, visibility of issues. I think also often undervalued is the element of community ties that could actually also be generated in protests. And there's been some interesting social movement research on how people form stronger connections to both one another and to issues through taking part in the act of physically being in space. I don't know if some of you might have experienced that attending any protests. But I think actually it's worth stepping back for even further than like, do protest work, to like, why do we do it and who do we do it for in the first place? And the reality is that we live in quite an imperfect but it's what we have, like, system, and it is a system that works differently for different individuals, and so protest is one of those few tools that we have to sometimes have our voices just heard in the democratic process. So in part, a lot of the people that are in charge of the systems that we all live under come from very similar backgrounds, have a similar kind of like, you know, work, lived experiences, etc. And so they produce very certain kinds of knowledges that often don't take into account various different things, sometimes consciously and sometimes subconsciously, because they haven't lived that. And so protest as part of, you know, a campaigning system is, or system of tools, is one way that lots of people with different experiences have, just to have their experiences heard or to get a seat at the table. And so a lot of the time, you know, I was working with individuals, for example, an incredible woman named Rosamond, whose daughter died as a result of pollution. And she was Black, and she was from living in an area that was subject to kind of like more air pollution than certain other areas might experience. And she used a range of like different organizing tools, including protest, to get the government and various different systems to take into account that, like, air pollution is killing people and is killing certain people more than others. And so protest can function as one of these tools that allows sort of like more marginalized people to kind of like have a say in the process. I think also, if we think about sort of like protest and organizing broadly, we all have systems that sometimes people don't do what they say they're going to do, or they work to support systems that work for them, maybe, or in the interest of capital, for example, rather than in the interest of people. And so we don't have that many tools at our disposal to get people, to get those with power to, you know, pay attention. I think you can probably think of thousands of examples. We've talked about the climate a lot. You know, another example might be people organizing around the NHS. The NHS is something that if you ask almost everyone in Britain, we hold it as like this dearest thing to our hearts. Like, creeping privatization has been happening in the UK. And one of the ways that people have been sort of organizing against that is through campaigns like Save Our NHS. And so, yeah, I would say that, you know, it might be flawed, but in our current system, it's one of the few tools that we have for kind of both equity and accountability. So thinking about this sort of like civic space, I just want to touch on it for a minute. I think we've talked a lot about all of these like creeping new legislations. I think that history that Richard gave was really important for us to think about the fact that we've never really had this. I think we're experiencing a specific threat right now that I think it's important that we really talk about, but we haven't really had this open space for protest. It's always kind of, you know, ring fence. It's been ring fence for a long time to certain extents, but I think that something we haven't really touched on here is also that it is ring fenced more or less for different groups of people. So, for example, you know, historically, protests by marginalized communities and those fighting against the interest of capital, for example, thinking about the climate, have often been subject to just like greater scrutiny or risks to organizing than some other modes of campaigning. When I was working at Change, we would really have to think about this very actively. If you were working with organizers who were working on a quote unquote more like palatable issue, for example, around health, we knew that we would be under less scrutiny. And so it would be possible to, you know, get away with more when you would protest without kind of like police intervention. Or, for example, if you had a celebrity there, you would be able to get away with certain more things than you might otherwise. So all these things could impact on like what the actual space that you were operating in looked like. And I would say that this new legislation is something that we really need to, you know, these new set of legislations and tools that are being used are incredibly important for us to think about, because they're impacting, I think, all of us more. But also within that, again, there is going to be a sort of like a gradation of who experiences more and less of this. So, for example, Amnesty recently did a bit of research into people that had been experiencing sort of criminalization working who've been protesting around Palestine. And it was largely people who were Muslim, who were neurodivergent and disabled, interestingly, that were more likely to face repercussions for their action than everyone else. So, you know, there's all these gradations that I think we need to think about. I don't want to one more thing to say is just that I'm going to be a bit happier towards the end of this, but is that it is these sets of legislations, though, are really having an impact on organisers. When I was doing research here last year, I was working with migrant justice. I was speaking with migrant justice organisers. I'd gone into the process being interested in how their sense of hope had been impacted by sort of like anti-migrant sort of policies that had been introduced by governments. And what I found was that people actually who had lost hope were more likely to have done so because of these new policies than they were because of policies directed towards like migrants, because they were expecting to fight against that. What they weren't expecting was to have, you know, threats to their tools that they use to organize in the first place. So I'm being asked to stop, but I do just want to end on a slightly more sort of like positive tone, or just like productive one, which is that it is still possible to organize really effectively within this context. One thing that I have seen lots of organizers who are doing that are managing to actually keep going is actually refocusing on hope. And so for those of you that are kind of like working in groups, I think this is interesting to think about, is like, how do you go back and look at what it means to remind people of what they're doing? And like, because that community element of protest can be kind of created by like hosting events or organizing something that creates the world that you want to get to in a way that kind of bypasses, you know, governments to begin with. I think there are much more creative means of protesting also when people get into these spaces that they start thinking about to get around these legislations. I've seen more sort of like boycotting, you know, mass refusals, like sending mass protest mails. But also, like, you know, protest is going to continue to happen, and it is like one, I think that it becomes even more important for us, and those of you that engage in protest might have experienced this too, to think about how you socialize people understanding what their sort of like rights are, how you can keep people safe within the kind of safe spaces. There's lots more sort of like handing out things like bust cards so that if people get arrested, they know what to do, what their rights are, etc. And finally, people have always protested through, you know, legislation and against legislation. We've seen people willing for example, the climate and Palestine to take actions knowing full well that they will face ramifications. In other countries like Iran, you know, there's the huge women's rights movement, even within a context of like extreme sort of like, you know, repression of protest. But what really becomes is it does become more dangerous, and it becomes more dangerous, as I mentioned, for different specific individuals. So the final thing I would just leave everyone is almost like a rallying cry to acknowledge that it might be very difficult or impossible to build an equitable sort of like system for protests, if it's even possible, but that we should be working, if we can, to fight against these legislations. And there are lots of great organizations like Liberty that are doing a huge amount of work to think about how that's possible. And thank you. That's everything from me.
Thanks, Pascal, Sam, and Richard. Now what we're going to have is for 15 to 20 minutes, we'll have a discussion among panelists, some of the points that they want to discuss and debate. And after that, we come to the main session of Q&A. So before we start that debate discussion here among panelists, I have a couple of questions. You can ignore them and discuss what you want. My question is, this is a 12th year in succession that there is a decline of global freedom. So why is this specific period such intense decline taking place? That's one question. And the second question I had in mind, and I still have it in mind, is it is not the only time that this kind of decline taking place. If you go back into the 70s in Latin America, for example, the time of dictatorships in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, all those places, there were much more kind of repression with the national emergencies, state of exception. So what are the lessons we learned from that period of dictatorships, lack of freedoms, and the one that is happening right now? So these are two questions I have, but feel totally free to discuss and raise your own questions and talk.
I would like to hear some of your thoughts on the second question, George, because I feel like you have quite a good insight into some of these.
I do research among the guerrillas in Colombia and also the Maoists in India. So the type of, most of the guerrilla movements in Latin America, for example, in the 70s, the movement was led by a lot of mass protests also. Mass protests on one hand, and then there are armed groups more operating more secretly, So this was a period going against dictatorships. And that's why you find such intense level of protest in many of those countries. And many of them failed. The repression was so intensive, it failed. But also in some places it changed, like in Nicaragua in 1985 and so on, it changed. So what did we learn? And what will happen in this constant decline of global freedoms in this period of last one decade, What do we, I don't know. I mean, this is something your studies, what do you think? What is the way out of it? Yeah.
Well, on the question of why the decline, it's a complex one, right? But I think one answer to that is most straightforwardly, there's a closing civic space because there's more activism and governments are trying to limit that activism from happening, right? That's one answer. But I think that's obviously incomplete. I think maybe another answer is why is civic space closing is because governments can get away with it. And there's a focus in the humanitarian world, which I came to before, on addressing impunity. And David Miliband from the IRC talks about the age of impunity. Essentially, states are increasingly getting away with human rights abuses, with breaches of international humanitarian law. We've been seeing that increasingly. And unless there's any consequences for that, unless there is any adequate pushback against limits on civil and political, social, economic, cultural rights, we're going to see more and more creeping erosion of those rights from states.
Anyone else want to come in? Pascal?
I think it's a very big and complex question that I don't know that I'm like fully equipped to give a entirely full answer to. Like, I do agree with you. I think that there is a like a growing socialization of protest. That I think also, things like the internet and media like play like a large part in. I also do think that there is growing inequalities that plays into this. Like, we have like a growing 1% and of whom often play quite a large role in shaping what a lot of these systems look like. Also, this 1% are quite connected with one another around the world. And I do think that the desire to sort of like maintain an order that works for that community is also shaping to some extent like a desire to suppress protest. I do also think that we don't have a particularly long historical view sometimes when we ask questions like this. Like, to some extent, I think that potentially we experienced like a level of, you know, like protest and freedoms at a specific period of time that we are now experiencing like a back tail against. And I'm not sure if we were to look at like the long tail of history, it would present such a neat picture of decline as sort of like an extra answer to that.
No, I think that's a very important point both of you raised, Sam and Pascale, about inequality, intensity of inequality, and the protest, and therefore repression. I think that seemed to be the pattern that is happening. You know, if when we talk about the 70s in Latin America, inequality, the intensity of inequality there, and right now the intensity of inequality, you know, and therefore the protest, and therefore repression. And this is Richard.
With legal humility, I'll speak to a narrow point that that I can about why this period of decline in this particular jurisdiction, this particular moment in time. I think this is an overreaction to protest that was indeed highly disruptive, and in many cases borderline on the right to peaceful protest. It really was on the outer limits of that proportionality point in some cases. And I think what we saw it was an overreaction. Before the Public Order Act 2023 came into play, there was already really significant civil injunctions kicking in. Protests, and these environmental protests had declined remarkably. The criminal offense, there was thousands of people being put through the courts and convicted because there were sufficient criminal offences there. Why a period of decline? We have to look at that particular governing period, which was a conservative government that was intolerant of dissent. This is the same government that wanted to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks coming up to the crunch moment for Brexit. This is the same government that didn't send its ministers on the BBC. This is the same government that Dominic Raab decided he didn't like the Human Rights Act and was going to fundamentally curtail aspects of that. So this is the context of that, but it's also taps into a deep vein of genuinely held conservative ideology, which is a real affinity for law and order, a real dislike for chaos, a commitment to institutional politics and trusting institutional politics and Parliament. And the idea that why would you go out and protest when you can vote and you can use the institutional channels? And you saw this in the legislative debates. They're saying, well, what's happening here? We decided on HS2, Parliament's voted. So I think that's part of it. I mean, you have the rhetoric of Boris Johnson saying he's going to lie down in front of bulldozers in an act of civil disobedience to stop a third runway. He was curiously absent during the vote. You know, there's this kind of rhetoric of liberties and freedoms, but when it came to it, this was a conservative, classic aspects of conservative, deep-seated conservative thinking, which is a version of civility that we can debate and we can discuss and that can be legitimately held. But it was combined with a real intolerance for forms of dissent.
I mean, so Pascale.
No, George, you can.
No, you go.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting point. And I do also think that it's like societally quite interesting to consider it, like what if we are to take sort of like that period of climate action as the reason for kind of like, at least in the UK, but maybe also around the world, for like the increase in sort of legislation, what brought people to the point that they felt that they needed to take such large scale action? And I think it's not very often that we've seen in very modern history such large scale action taking place with a government, or not just like a government, but also all of the people that hold this institutional power, like refusing to take any sort of like action or listen to where like a huge swathe of the population had really deep feeling. And I think that we think about sort of like this action, this sort of like increase in legislation, in part, I think it does connect to the desire to, you know, obfuscate and sort of like really go against when you have like institutions that are very far against like the will of the people. Yeah.
No, I found, I think, Richard, the point that you raised about conservative governments in power. So the ideology of the government, that seems to have a clear impact. And yet, why do we always choose conservative governments? Like in Europe, if you look at the moment, or in the US, why, despite the fact, if we ask individually, everyone loves to have freedom, democracy, but still there is a preference for conservative governments, knowing that it will lead to further repression, decline of freedoms. So what is it that in human nature that goes for more conservative forms of government?
You're really asking the big questions.
Mhm.
No, I mean, you don't have to answer me. It's my own. I'm grappling with my own questions. Yeah, so you don't have it. Any other thoughts you have?
This has got me thinking a lot about where is activism heading. And again, we've talked a lot about 2019 and the emergence of a mass climate movement. So for the first time, maybe in history, a mass movement that engaged in civil disobedience and law breaking. I'm sure you probably know the history better than I do, but it feels like one of the consequences of this new legislation is you're going to have far fewer people willing to engage in activism. So I've been doing interviews with lots of Extinction Rebellion or former Extinction Rebellion activists. And these are people who are mostly older, who are mostly live in the home counties, who probably vote Lib Dem, who probably never engaged in activism before. And they enthusiastically got out on the streets and got arrested on purpose for something they believed in. Now, none of the people that I spoke to would even consider engaging in activism now. Some of whom not even on a legal protest, because of civil injunctions. I spoke to a number of people who have been under civil injunction for years, awaiting a court hearing, probably going to have to pay thousands of pounds, along with hundreds of other people. Someone was on a civil injunction with 300 other people. They're not going to lie down in the street and get arrested again, or even join a protest again, right? So what's the upshot of all of this? You get an increasingly or decreasing number of people that are willing to do protest and put their liberty on the line, because they're probably going to get arrested, they're probably going to get charged, they're probably going to go to prison now as well, for up to 5 years in some cases. And so whether or not you agree with the tactics, I think if you think that it's important that people should be allowed to express their views in public places, then you should be worried about this type of protest. And I also think it's a problem, like one of the things that research that we've been doing to try and understand what makes a protest movement successful, along with things like non-violence, is a really, like, historically across history, non-violent protests have been far more effective than any protests that employ violence. Something called worthiness. So basically, do the public have a sense that what you're doing is valuable and is right? Coherence and diversity. So do you represent a broad base of the population? Do you represent a broad range of tactics, a broad range of strategies? But probably the most important factor that determines success in social movements is numbers, right? You have to be able to demonstrate that you have public support, that you're representing in some fashion the will of the people, whatever that is really. And if legislation is meaning that you're not able to get numbers in support of your cause, then that's a problem if you believe in civil and political rights.
I think that's really interesting. And actually, I mean, we were talking about this before, and I touched on this in my presentation. Something that I found when speaking with sort of migrant justice activists is that a lot of them were also turning away from like traditional means of protest. And whilst, at least for that community, they weren't stopping engaging altogether, they were turning towards sort of inwards sort of kind of organizing. So I mentioned about sort of trying to create the world that they want to see sort of like within their small communities. And whilst I think that there are some really amazing sort of initiatives that have come out of that, what that also means is that none of those folks are sort of actively saying what, they're not actively protesting in a way that any sort of like decision makers that are currently shaping our society can necessarily hear. And so that space in some ways can, I think to some people looking from the outside feel more kind of like, you know, vacant, or you don't have yeah, those voices become sort of missing because people are finding different ways, which are having good upshots, but they're also, I don't know, it's a loss to not have that sort of yeah, I guess that sort of civic conversation taking place. Yeah. Yeah.
We could open the conversation to yes, you can raise your hand, state your name and affiliation. Same thing for online audience too. So shall we? Yeah. Yes. Oh, shall we start from here? And then, yes.
Thank you very much for the really interesting conversation. My name is Cesar Jimenez Martinez, and I'm assistant professor in media and communications here at LSE. And there is something that I wanted to ask you, because quite often discussions about the right to protest stress that the right to protest is valid as long as protests are peaceful or non-violent. So I wonder to what extent that definition matters from a legal, tactical, and organizational perspective. And if it matters, who defines what is violent or non-violent? I ask you that because, for instance, I always think of the case of the suffragettes, very much celebrated at this university, that they put bombs in post boxes, they destroyed windows and so on, and some people have even argued that they were terrorists. And nowadays there are even buildings with their names here at this university. So thank you very much.
I want to respond to that question, any of you?
Sure. So it matters legally. It matters an awful lot because it's peaceful protest that's protected by Articles 10 and 11. When it moves outside of peaceful, that definition of peaceful, it no longer enjoys the protections. What I mean by protections is that an arrest, detention, prosecution, conviction, sentence are all interferences with the right. So if it's peaceful, then those interferences have to be justified using this legal concept of proportionality. And ultimately it comes down to this fair balance that's been struck, which is partly factual, partly normative question that the court jury are engaging with. Peaceful matters an awful lot, and we've seen the European Court of Human Rights being quite protective of that term and how it's defined. You can have highly disruptive protest that is still peaceful and requires justification. But the more disruptive you get and the outer edges of that peacefulness, it becomes easier for the state to justify the interference, and the seesaw starts the weight starts to fall down on the side of the state more so. It matters a lot. What we've seen is it being applied to non-violent forms, or what we've been seen is this translation of peaceful to forms of criminal damage. And what we're seeing is this bifurcation between some types of criminal damage that are temporary, transient, minor, that are deemed peaceful, and thus the prosecution, conviction has to be justified. And we're seeing other instances of criminal damage where they say this is outside of what's peaceful and it doesn't have to be justified. So we're starting to see the legal technicalities becoming really quite important in terms of the justificatory work that a judge or that the state is required to do. So legally it matters a lot.
Sam, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think and what you're getting at really is it really matters how people perceive the protests, right? Do they consider it as violent, as if you're causing criminal damage, causing sabotage, blowing up pipelines, those types of things? A good portion of the public will consider that as crossing the line. And I come back to this research by Erica Chenoweth, which looked historically across history. It was more like looking at armed uprisings and coups and those types of things. And finding that not only is like particularly armed violence, but also other types of violence unpopular, it's also less effective. And I think that's a really important lesson for activists is like your campaign, your movement, your participatory struggle is more likely to be effective, partly because you're more likely to keep a larger portion of the public on side with what you're doing, right? So it comes back to that point on worthiness. You'll be considered a worthy campaign if you're seen as adopting non-violent principles of non-violent civil disobedience, and you go right back to Gandhi and others.
Want to speak, Pascale?
No, I think it's, I think that you are right, Sam, that but it depends on, you know, how a lot of the public view it. And I also think that that notion of what is peaceful will also like vary throughout history. Like I actually don't know that at the time that the suffragettes were, for example, you know, were taking those actions that you know, that people were kind of like on side of what they were doing. I don't think that they were on the whole. And peace is often something that is afforded to, is defined by legislation, which is defined by governments and those that hold power. And I'm not, you know, advocating for any form of specific action, but I do think that it is sort of like relevant that some, you know, those that are organizing are not allowed to are expected to have a different standard to the level of sort of like non-violence or peace that those that they are organizing against are afforded. And yeah, I just think that our notions of what we consider okay or acceptable will probably look quite different in retrospect than they do in the moment that they take place often.
We had one hand raised there before we go on to the online audience.
Hi, I'm Advait. I'm a third-year undergraduate politics student at LSE. I wanted to ask a big picture question, which is, there's a famous adage that no protest that has accrued more than 3.5% of the population has ever failed. I wanted to ask broadly how much credence you lend to that, and secondly, whether it's as applicable to a diffuse issue such as climate change with multifaceted policy proposals as opposed to a single issue campaign.
Yeah.
I think you'll probably have some really good stats for this one, perhaps. I would take a go at it though, that I think like, you know, nice big stats are nice. And I do think but I think that your point about and I do think that there is like some truth broadly that when you have more of the sort of like of a population on side, you are more likely to win. But I do think that the sort of question that you almost answered for yourself within the question is that I think there is a large difference between like big movements that have sort of a swathe of different sort of objectives. Sometimes even within themselves, they don't have the same, that not everyone is aligned on what those objectives even are, and on what a very sort of like a specific tangible sort of like campaign ask might be. So like when I was at Change, it was definitely true that if people were working on really specific small policy changes, you know, a protest could win if it even had like, you know, 50, 40, sometimes 10 people that would turn up to an event, like events. It wouldn't be the protest alone, but that sort of organizing didn't need such large swathes of the population, particularly if you could get the right, you know, decision makers or politicians or different bits of the media on side. I had another point that I wanted to make, but I'll let someone else take over.
Okay, you jump back in. If
Yeah.
you remember. Yeah, the 3.5%. I wish I had Google or was allowed to Google things, because I read a study that said basically was arguing against that, saying actually there has been cases, maybe you know of a case where a particular movement, a campaign mobilized a huge portion of the population and was successful. I see that more as an effective mobilizing tool, because movements don't win very often and it's hard to get people motivated. And again, sorry to always bring this back to 2019 and climate change and Extinction Rebellion, but that 3.5% was an argument to say we don't need that many people to actually to win meaningful change on like no new oil and gas or whatever the particular demands of the movement. Because 3.5% doesn't sound very much, does it? I mean, in reality, it is millions of people. It's incredibly difficult to mobilize that number of people. But I think it's a reflection of the fact that being able to not only mobilize a huge number of people in support of a cause, but sustain their energy is incredibly difficult. So you need clear targets like that. And also coming back to your point on like narrow wins, sometimes you don't need a large number of people, but you need something that you feasibly can win. and you need to be able to actually hang your hat on particular things over the course of, say, 6 months. And I think like winning is underrated in social movements. People are so obsessed with the struggle, and like, for example, lots of movements have been calling for no new oil and gas, and then the Labour government announced they would be doing no new oil and gas exploration. I didn't see many people spending much time celebrating. It was straight on to the next thing, and in a way, it's inherent in the personality of an activist, right? Is like, we need the next fight because we're never gonna ultimately win. But I think it's important to take some time, if only for mental health and for our own like humanity, to take some time to understand when you actually have won, and like maybe take a break, even if it's temporarily, because like you're not going to sustain these campaigns over years if you don't.
Are you okay? Okay. Shall we take a couple of questions online first, and then Peter, if we have any question online, do you be able to read out?
So we got 2 questions online. The first is from Barnaby Jackson, who's a fine artist who works on protest wear. And they say, can our engagement with elected representatives be more structured or enhanced in some way? They wonder how democracy can be made more effective and engaging on the district council level, or more hopefully via local community engagement. The second question is anonymous. Said the restrictions to peaceful protest don't come only from governments, but can come from a lot of other institutions. For example, the repression of protesters at American universities over the last year. And they'd like to hear more from the panelists about how we can make sense of non-governmental anti-protest measures from a critical perspective.
Yeah, anyone wants to go? It's a very interesting question, not just the governments, but non-governmental organizations.
I mean, in terms of the first question, how can we find other ways to affect change, or like engage with democracy? And there's a really exciting movement of people and activists engaging in trying to bring about citizens' assemblies. I think that was a key demand of many different social movements, is we need different avenues to try and raise our voice, not least because I think protest is a really blunt instrument, right? It's one way in which you can raise an issue, but it's not an effective way to negotiate policy, right? And actually, you have seen protesters engage in advocacy as well. I think that they can be very credible advocates for particular issues, but they're not going to do it on the streets, you know. And so, are there other ways in which people can have their voices heard? And I think there was a really interesting citizens' assembly in Germany about Germany's role in the world. So it's basically, you normally find citizens' assemblies we've had them on climate, for example, but this was about what should the country's foreign policy be? And I think that's like the type of issue that isn't normally debated and engaged in those types of forums. But I think there's no reason why we can't dip our toe into lots of different avenues. But the key then is, do policymakers and politicians listen to the outcomes of these assemblies? Like, do they really respect the policies and the views that come out of them? And I think like, it's not necessarily the answer, but it's one answer to not only have a more democratic system, but also to have a system that's more responsive to the wider public.
I couldn't agree more. I am such a fan of sort of participatory democratic processes. And I think that they are, like Barnaby speaking about the local, I think they're actually incredibly, have a lot of opportunity to be super effective at a local level, because you can really get a sense of, it's a smaller community that you're sort of working with, and people, I don't know, I think local councils also have the opportunity to do things that really speak to people within that community. But I think that it's really important to have things like citizens' assemblies or etc. Like, if we can, introducing them at every level. There is a fellow who was also at part of the AFSEE fellows last year with me, who is specifically working on how you do participatory processes of it using theatre, which I think is actually incredibly exciting and interesting. And she was actually partnering with local councils across the country. And so, for example, a local council would want to do something like have a new strategy to tackle homelessness. They would have a combination of people that had a my lived experience of homelessness and people that just were interested in a part of the local community. And they would play out almost role playing of different solutions to how you would deal with different problems that people would come up with. And people would almost stop and do improv and say, no, this wouldn't work. This is what my experience was like, etc. And then they would perform it. And with the audience and the people who put on the performance, they would come up with a set of policy proposals. And actually there are councils across the country that are creating policy based on this process. And it sounds very sort of like radical and different. But I actually think finding these different ways to kind of like engage and make the process of thinking about how we create a society that works for everyone fun is like exciting and important work. Yeah. Does anyone want to talk about the second question?
I want to talk briefly about the first question.
yes,
which is-
sorry.
sorry, which is the engagement with elected representatives. And I want in the context of the Public Order Act, to talk about actually the involvement of unelected representatives. It's not popular to talk desperately favorably about the House of Lords as an unelected chamber, but there was some serious line-by-line scrutiny that tempered the Public Order Act 2023. We have former law lords speaking critically about the extent of these powers. You had Lord Anderson, the former Counter Review of Terrorism legislation, persuading the government, bringing an amendment and persuading the government not to enact serious disruption prevention orders where there is no criminal offence having taken place. Lord Hope, former law lord, trying to tighten up the meaning of these offences. Former Director of Public Prosecutions raising the red flag about some of these offences. So actually, this is where we saw the House of Lords at its best in doing extremely careful scrutiny and making amendments that were successful in reining in aspects of this. So I'm going to be unpopular and say actually it's the unelected House here that did some extremely good scrutiny work on this legislation. And in fact, when the government tried to achieve the lock on various other powers in the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act, at almost midnight in the House of Lords, ministers stood up and tried to introduce over 60 lines of legislation that had never been introduced in the House of Commons. And the House of Lords said, this is a constitutional outrage. How dare you bring this before us with such limited scrutiny and third reading to try and bring about such remarkable powers. And it ended up coming in through the Public Order Act. But having looked very closely at the Hansard, the House of Lords really proved its mettle, I thought. So that's unelected representatives. But I think lobbying them, raising their attention, bringing their skills, is possibly an untapped resource. The non-governmental organisations, I'm not well equipped to speak to that jurisdiction, and focusing on rights, my focus is generally government and state power. So I'll leave that one to somebody better able to speak to that on the panel or in the audience. But absolutely, it's an omission in our discussion.
I mean,
State apparatuses.
I think that the one thing that I'll say is that legislation is like never created in a vacuum. And so, governments don't create like the idea that a government would create legislation and there wouldn't be any other actors that held sort of like similar perspectives or had similar interests is usually like quite unlikely. And I think that also the introduction of a lot of this sort of like legislation and new powers sort of like helps to feed a culture in which a lot of other institutions like universities feel like they then have a bit more legitimacy to then act in certain ways that they might not have otherwise. Yeah.
And we've already talked about the rise of civil injunctions, and that's a non-state form of privatized legal system in which companies are increasingly exploiting it. And I did research on the anti-fracking campaign. I think that's what you're talking about, right? Before 2019, that was one of the initial tools that was increasingly widespread against anti-fracking activists, was companies filing these widespread injunctions.
The Secretary of State now has the power to bring to launch civil injunctions as well. It's another feature of the Public Order Act 2023 is bringing the Secretary of State into this as well. So yeah, civil injunctions meets state power. Yeah.
Here we had a couple of people had raised their hands. We start with the first person.
Thank you. I'm visiting professor at the law school at here at LSE. And I wanted to ask you if those laws that limit the right to protest are not only for like small demonstration, are there, because if there is a giant demonstration and everybody locks themselves up, like million people, so the police can't do anything about it. So actually, it will harm again only the smaller groups, the weaker groups that cannot protest in such numbers.
Shall we take one more question there? And then maybe we have 10 minutes, basically 10 to 12 minutes.
Hello, Harry Barlow. No affiliations, just a humble layperson. We've talked a lot today about sort of in-person protests, sort of gets lots of coverage in the news, but form of protesting that is kind of I'm interested in, and whether it's even worth discussion, is digital protests. So naturally, a lot of these protests start online, you form a community online, you get lots of eyeballs online. Why is it that then, firstly, how effective is protesting through social media and gathering campaigns and even getting your policy change through that? And how does the legislature, which is sort of narrowing the scope of in-person protesting, leading to potentially an extrapolation of that in the digital world?
One more question. We take three. There was one hand there. Yeah.
So firstly, thank you all for a very interesting talk. My name is Lukman. I'm a PhD student here at LSE. Oh, okay. Okay. I will try and project. My name is Lukman. I'm a PhD student here at LSE. I broadly focus on contentious politics, looking at Palestine. And I sort of had two questions directed at the panel. My first sort of building off the second question that came from the online part. I think the increase in the use of civil injunctions by non-state actors is something that is quite insidious and terrifying in a way. And certainly when I think about it in the context of sort of pro-Palestine protests, the fact that we've seen universities more recently use it to crack down on student protests is something that to me is very alarming in general. You know, I think a few days ago now, Cambridge University obtained a civil injunction banning protest in certain parts of the university. Last year, LSE also something similar. And so to me, that is something that definitely needs to be talked about. Because I think whereas companies in many ways are broadly sort of amoral actors, universities to me have a duty to sort of foster these kinds of discussions more generally. My second question is, I think it's Charles Tilley who sort of broadly sort of says that contentious politics in general is sort of acts of, you know, political claim making by groups against the state, right? And so in this context where we're seeing sort of protests being cracked down on, is there not a distinct fear perhaps that people who previously may have wanted to protest may be driven towards engaging in more radical forms of protest, more violent forms of protest perhaps? And tied to that, if people conceive of mainstream parties as not listening to their views because they aren't able to protest, will that perhaps drive more people towards voting for more radical anti-system parties that will then also have a sort of negative effect on democracy and may lead to democratic backsliding. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. Would you like to go to any three questions from any from people? Yeah. The first one was about the smaller groups, and then from more on social media, the protest and its impact. And then here again, non-state actors. One part of the question was non-state actors. Then on the second part also.
I'm sure you'll have plenty to say about digital protests
I'll
among the
take
other
that
bits, but I'll take it as well. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think it's really
just-
interesting because this was a big debate and in terms of digital protests in 2011 and the Arab uprisings and Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street. 'Cause suddenly now we had Twitter and Facebook and social media, and it was like, okay, is this going to be a force multiplier? Or there was an article by Malcolm Gladwell around the time saying the revolution will not be tweeted. And that was kind of quite sneering attitude, basically saying no one really needs to put themselves on the line anymore. Everyone can just sign a petition. I mean, I worked at Oxfam for many years, and our go-to was always, we'll just do a petition about it, because we can have the illusion of reaching a lot of people because you get tens of thousands of people signing a thing, but does it really change anything? And I remember getting some pretty angry responses from MPs saying, if you weren't clogging up my inbox, I'd have time to actually do something about this issue. And so, I mean, I think that there is a valid critique towards digital activism, which is it's very low commitment. And is it actually, for some people in their mind, replacing putting their feet on the ground, boots on the ground and getting involved? I think in reality, it ends up being a hybrid, right? So it hasn't replaced activism. You get a lot of people who make initial connections or form connections across international boundaries, find new people, like-minded people who care about their issues online. But I think you can still see a key factor in successful movements is actually people forming that social capital, building those bonds in person. And that's how you get people involved in the long term. So it ends up being, I think, a hybrid model.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with you. I think that campaigns are usually never won from one tactic. And I think it is a little bit simplified to sometimes put tactics into sort of like offline and online, when actually within those tactics, there's like a huge amount of variation. You know, from like tradition, you know, offline you can have traditional large protests, boycotts, etc. As I mentioned, digital campaigning, I think it's easy to think of just petitions, but there's also things like I don't know, lots of the actions that you can do on social media pages, etc. And I have seen campaigns that never were able to organize in person be extremely successful. They weren't usually just they weren't one tactic, but rather they might have started with a petition, for example, and then use that to do a host of different sort of digital organizing in different places. Some people do really creative sorts of organizing, like, you know, like creating like videos that make fun of XYZ or whatever. I'm not really giving any good examples here, but you understand. And then some of those get picked up by the media, for example, and then decision makers respond to that action that never really required anyone to be in person. I think sometimes, whilst I really do, what I believe in is people taking, you know, thinking about campaigns holistically. I think sometimes it's easy to say that online is the problem, when actually, as well as making it easier, sounds like maybe it can allow people to be lazy, but making it easier has also facilitated a lot of people that can't always engage offline to engage. So I know some people that, for example, had disabilities that made it difficult for them to attend protests in person, really relied on being able to use digital organizing in order to advocate for you know, issues that they believed in a way that they felt that they couldn't do before. And so I think that it is just worth sort of like, yeah, caveating or complicating sort of like this like collectivism, etc. picture. That being said, I think, yeah, I really believe in community, doing things that are like different and make an impact, finding ways to get your decision makers' attention, all of which I think can be done through a myriad of different possibilities. Yeah.
Shorter answers to anybody here? Any of the questions that came from?
Yeah. So briefly, I think the question of impact on scale is an interesting one, and I think, as we're touching on, I think you might have individuals or smaller groups who could really feel the chill effect of this, particularly if this is protesting and entering these civic spaces is something new to them. I would caveat that with when it comes to widespread protest, the policing machine is extremely effective in the command structure, in the use of powers, evidence gathering techniques. And now we have suspicionless stop and search powers, where if you're in a vicinity and the police don't even, if they suspect you might have a lock-on device, they can search you. Even if they don't have a suspicion, they can search you. So part of these tools were also designed to be applied at scale. And so I'd say even large groups could find themselves not locking on because of the police operation that can act very preemptively, and the law has encouraged to do so. On the question of whether we're going to see a radicalization in response because the current repertoires of claim making and contentious politics aren't cutting through, whether we see radicalization towards non-peaceful protest or changing in voting patterns towards more radical parties. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I think the law again has been targeted at that radical core, so it's going to become even harder for that radical core to protest radically and non-peacefully. Serious disruption prevention orders have been put in place to stop that core group being able to go about exercising protest rights. And what we've seen is the courts incapacitating these radical protesters with long deterrent sentences. So I think even that radical core are going to find it increasingly difficult to act radically.
There was one hand here that I missed. So please, this is the last question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Rino Siconolfi, MBA at LSI. I want to focus about the importance of an advanced legislation in the process of management of the right of protest and the management of the manifestation. Because the process of the right of the management of the right of protest is measure also if a democracy is mature or not, if a legislation is advanced or not, especially because today there are also the social media that affect the atmosphere around the manifestation. So if I look at the UK, I can think that I live in a multicultural society with an advanced legislation. But for example, if I make the comparison with the US, I'm by US mother, so I know well the society. I notice, for example, that the legislation is affected by the Second Amendment, so it's easy to buy weapons. This affects also the rules of engagement of the police, and also this affects the management of the manifestation. And you was right before when you told that one of the factors that affect positively a manifestation is a not violence manifestation. But obviously, all this depends by the legislation if it's advanced or not.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bias, and I guess we're protected because the name of this event is Democracy and the Right to Protest in the UK. So we focused on advanced democracies or liberal democracies. But of course, there's a much wider school of research and on the role, like repression of environmental defenders around the world, or of people protesting in repressive states, and which is an entirely different game, and entirely different for our research, which looks at what makes protests effective. Well, it's going to be a completely different set of criteria in Europe or the US compared to elsewhere, for example. And something else is not quite what you asked, but I really want to mention it, is often when we talk about protest or social movements, we have this assumption that we're talking about progressive movements. And that's clearly not always the case, right? Some of the most successful social movements over history have been conservative, have been counter movements, have been right-wing movements. And I think that's an increasingly important, coming back to your point on the radicalization of politics as a result of the failure of institutions and politicians to respond to the public's demands. But one thing you get is clearly is an increasingly rise in counter movements. We saw the Gilets jaunes in France, we saw the anti-lockdown movements. We've seen not quite a protest movement, but plenty of conservative movements in support of gun rights or in support of pro-life issues. So I think like this is definitely reflected in the research and the literature as well, is this kind of like progressive bias, and actually social movements are much broader than that. Didn't answer your question, but I just wanted to say it anyway.
It's a good point to add on, I think.
It's already 8 o'clock, and that's when we are planning to stop it, because we all have to go back and it's getting late. First of all, I want to thank our speakers, panelists. Thank you amidst your busy schedule coming in, speaking to us and engaging in this important conversation. And also all of you online audiences and in person, thank you so much for coming. And we will continue this conversation outside with a complimentary drink. Thank you very much.
Great.
Insightful.
Thank you, George.